The world was not a stage, but a tomb. It was an obsidian darkness, thick and oppressive, that smelled of sulfur and wet rock. Tatsuya Kurosawa crouched in that subterranean silence, the air heavy with the weight of the mountain above. He was 25, but the darkness had already aged him, etching fine lines of exhaustion around his eyes. A thin, pale scar traced a path above his left eyebrow, a ghost from a childhood accident that had left his right eye blind. He was left-handed, a subtle peculiarity that forced him to constantly adjust, the rifle feeling clumsy against the damp wall of the tunnel. Above them, the American bombardment was a symphony of annihilation. The earth trembled, a constant low growl that shook loose small showers of volcanic dust from the tunnel ceiling. It was a relentless rhythm of destruction, a savage beat against the drum of the world. But here, deep inside the labyrinth of rock and earth, it was merely an echo, a distant promise of the chaos that raged on the surface. The silence between the concussions was the real enemy, a living, breathing thing that filled the spaces between heartbeats and whispered of what was to come. It was in this silence that fear, a cold, bitter fluid, seeped into his bones. He was not alone. Next to him, Yoshiro Tanaka, barely 22, shifted his weight. His face was young and clean-shaven, a testament to the misplaced idealism that still clung to him. He was a devout man, his faith evident in the way he clutched a small Ofuda amulet in his hand, his lips moving silently in prayer. Yoshiro was still a boy, not a soldier, and the sight of his innocence was a sharp, bitter pain to Tatsuya. He was a symbol of everything that Tatsuya feared losing, a fragment of a life that felt 1,000,000 years away. Yoshiro's posture was too straight, too rigid for this cramped space, reflecting a spirit that the war had yet to bend or break. Across from them, Kenji Ito, a veteran of other forgotten islands, sat with a hardened, calloused stillness. He was 29, and a thin, scraggly mustache was the only thing on his face that showed a hint of his age. Kenji's movements were economical, calculated. His gaze a calculated survey of the darkness. He had seen too much. He carried no illusions of glory, only the quiet pragmatism of a man who knew the war was already lost. His uniform, more worn and faded than the others, was a silent testament to his experience on other fronts, a history of battles and defeats that he never spoke of. He simply existed, a stoic anchor in a sea of despair. A voice, sharp and disciplined, cut through the quiet from a distant chamber. It was Captain Hiroshi Sato, a man whose orders were a constant reminder of their fate. He was 45, and his voice, though tired, still carried the weight of authority. He was calling their patrol to the main bunker, his tone betraying a new and profound sense of urgency. Communications had failed, a common occurrence in this labyrinth of rock and earth. They were to be the eyes of the unit, a scout party sent out to a section of the tunnel that seemingly had been compromised. He felt a phantom warmth on his hands, the smooth, polished grain of hinoki wood under his fingertips. For a moment, he was not in a dark cave of death, but in his father's carpentry workshop back at home, the air fragrant with sawdust and the gentle rasp of a chisel. The memory was brief but sharp, a painful contrast to the choking smell of sulfur. Their mission, they knew, was suicide, but they had no choice. They had been indoctrinated to believe that surrender was a betrayal not just of the emperor, but of their families. To die was to be a hero, a cherry blossom of a man, wilting gloriously in the service of a sacred cause. He had believed it once, when the propaganda posters had filled the streets of Tokyo and the songs of patriotism had echoed from every radio. But now, as he listened to the silence of the earth and felt the damp chill in his bones, All he wanted was to feel the warmth of the sun on his face and the soft touch of his younger sister's hand. He was not a warrior by choice. He was an apprentice of wood, a man who yearned to build, not to destroy. He had a family to return to, a life of quiet peace to reclaim. His desire to live was his true act of rebellion, a small internal war against the very culture that had sent him to die. It was a secret, selfish dream he held close to his heart, a fire he refused to let the darkness extinguish. He didn't want glory. He wanted a return. The patrol moved like ghosts through the permanent darkness. Their lanterns cast trembling, anemic circles of light that danced on their rough-hewn walls, illuminating nothing but the next few feet of claustrophobia. The tunnels were a true hellscape, a maze of dead ends and false turns. The ground was slick with moisture, a constant foul-smelling drip that echoed in the oppressive quiet. Tatsuya, with his limited vision, felt the cave not just with his eyes, but with his body. He felt the suffocating heat radiating from the volcanic rock, the oppressive weight of the earth pressing down on him. The texture of the walls, rough and jagged, told him where to place his hands. His nostrils, now acutely sensitive, were on constant alert for any change in the air, a subtle shift from the constant, sickening smell of sulfur and mold. They moved deeper, navigating a labyrinth that seemed to breathe with a sinister purpose. The air grew thicker, the humidity so high it felt like they were breathing liquid. The suspense was a physical sensation, a knot in Tatsuya's stomach. The darkness was a shroud. A faint, almost imperceptible sound of scuffling up ahead sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. Kenji raised a hand, his movement swift and silent. He signaled for them to stop. They listened. All they heard was the slow drip of water and the thudding of their own hearts. Then Tatsuya's keen ear caught something else. Not a sound, but a subtle change in the air. The scent of something foreign, of sweat and leather that did not belong to them. It was a quiet scent of death, of a different kind of prey. His hand tightened on his rifle, his grip so firm his knuckles ached. The Americans. They were close. The three men crept forward, Tatsuya's senses heightened to an almost unbearable degree. The silence was punctuated only by their ragged breathing, the soft scrape of their boots on the volcanic ash that coated the tunnel floor, and the distant, muffled thud of artillery fire. They turned a sharp corner and came face to face with them. A platoon of American Marines, their faces smudged with dirt and exhaustion, were attempting to clear a passage. The surprise was mutual. The battle that followed was not a heroic standoff, but a brutal, chaotic melee in the dark. The cramped space rendered their heavy weaponry useless. It was a fight of bayonets and fists, of muffled grunts and the sharp, metallic tang of blood. Kenji moved with a seasoned brutality, his rifle a deadly extension of his will. Yoshiro, for the first time, was not an innocent bystander. He fought with the desperate courage of a man clinging to an ideal he had never truly tested. Tatsuya was an artist in a world of war, and his moves were an improvised dance of survival. He dodged a bayonet thrust and slammed the butt of his rifle into a Marine's stomach. The sound was a sickening thud. The Marine fell, clutching his stomach, his face a mask of agony. Tatsuya did not pause. The fear and panic were a raging torrent inside him, but he suppressed it, turning his focus on the fight, a dance of shadows and steel in the suffocating darkness. The scent of gunpowder filled the air, acrid and sharp, overwhelming the sulfur for a brief, terrifying moment. He could taste the metallic tang of blood, the grit of volcanic ash on his teeth, the sweat burning his eye. The world narrowed to a single, chaotic point, a moment of pure, animalistic survival. He was not a hero. He was just a man, fighting to live.
They scrambled away, leaving the carnage behind them. But they were not unscathed. Yoshiro was limping, a jagged wound in his thigh. He grunted in pain but did not cry out, his face a mask of white-knuckled endurance. Tatsuya and Kenji half carried him, pulling him deeper into the tunnel system, but they were not fast enough. The Marines were right behind them, their heavy boots thudding on the rock. Tatsuya heard the low hiss of a flamethrower, an almost melodic sound that promised a fiery death. He felt a moment of pure, unadulterated terror. The tunnel ahead was a wall of fire, a roaring inferno of orange and yellow light that licked the air and made it crackle with heat. "Go, just go!" Kenji shouted, shoving him. Tatsuya hesitated, looking at Yoshiro. The wall of fire was coming closer, its heat a palpable force. A sudden memory, so vivid it was almost tangible, flashed in his mind. He was a boy, and he was climbing a tree with his younger sister. They were laughing, their hands sticky from the sweet juice of a persimmon. He had promised her he would return home to build her a new swing. He had to live, he had to. He pushed forward, a desperate surge of adrenaline, leaving a part of himself behind. He heard the roar of the flamethrower behind them. He heard the sudden, desperate shriek. The sound was not a human cry, but a single, heart-wrenching sound of a dream dying. He kept running, the screams muffled by the walls but not silenced. He kept running, the smell of burning flesh, of Yoshiro's burning flesh, a pungent and horrific cloud that clung to his clothes, his hair, his very skin. He could not get it out. The memory of the scent would haunt him forever, a constant, sickening reminder of the day he abandoned a friend. They found a small crevice and hid, listening to the muffled sounds of the battle above. The tunnel had become their grave. Yoshiro's death was not glorious. There were no songs of honor sung. It was a silent, brutal end, witnessed only by the suffocating darkness of a tunnel and the cold, unyielding rock. Tatsuya felt a profound, debilitating grief. It was not just the death of a comrade, but the death of a lie. The promise of an honorable death was a cruel joke. A more extended flashback, a dreamlike sequence, showed a conversation with Yoshiro before the invasion. They were sitting on a beach, the sound of the waves a soft whisper. Yoshiro had spoken of his family, of his hopes. He had a small, new baby he had never met. He had plans to return, to have a garden, to teach his son how to fish. He had talked about it with such a quiet, certain faith. He had described the small, wooden house his wife had found for them, the way the light streamed through the shoji screens in the morning. He had a pocket-sized picture of his wife in her traditional kimono, the vibrant colors a stark contrast to the grim reality of their current existence. Now, all of that was gone. The thought of that baby, fatherless and alone, was a pain more profound than any wound. The taste of blood in Tatsuya's mouth was not from his own injury. It was the bitter taste of defeat, of a promise that could never be kept. He felt a wave of nausea. He was not a hero. He was a coward, a man who had chosen his own life over the life of a friend. He felt a profound sense of shame, a heavy weight that settled on his shoulders, an internal burden that would be heavier than any backpack. The guilt gnawed at him, a constant, unseen companion. He was no longer fighting for honor or glory. He was just fighting to survive, a hollow man in a hollow world.
Days bled into a meaningless blur. It was impossible to tell night from day in the permanent darkness of the tunnels. Tatsuya and Kenji, now just two isolated ghosts in the machine of war, were on the verge of total exhaustion. Hunger gnawed at their stomachs, a hollow, persistent ache that they could no longer ignore. Thirst had dried their mouths to the consistency of sand, their tongues swollen and rough. The constant, dizzying presence of the sulfur smell, a reminder of the suffocating, hellish prison they were in, had begun to feel like a part of their own bodies, a permanent and foul perfume. They found a small alcove and collapsed, their bodies screaming with every movement. Kenji, the usually stoic veteran, was muttering to himself, his thoughts a quiet stream of cynicism that Tatsuya could only partially decipher. He had seen this before, on other islands, other losing battles. He knew the pattern, the slow, agonizing descent into madness and despair. A radio transmission crackled to life, a desperate, final plea from Captain Sato. His voice was tired, but firm. His orders were clear. All remaining forces were to converge for a final, glorious charge. A banzai attack in the name of the Emperor. It was an order to die. The words echoed in the darkness, a solemn, terrifying command. Tatsuya felt the familiar pull of duty, a voice that had been ingrained in him since birth. The code of the warrior, the honor of the samurai, demanded that he go. But the memory of Yoshiro's horrific death, of his own quiet desire to return home, to fulfill the promise he made to his sister, was stronger. He looked at Kenji. The veteran simply shook his head, a silent, knowing gesture. "Glory is for those who are not here," Kenji commented, his voice a dry rasp. He argued that the word was a fabrication, a tool used to convince men to die for a lost cause. It is a story for those who will write the history books, not for those who will be buried in this earth. The words were a bitter truth, a final dismantling of the heroic narrative that had brought them to this desolate place. The radio continued to crackle with static, a faint hum that seemed to mock their predicament. The American propaganda leaflets, which had fluttered down from the sky like strange foreign butterflies, had promised good treatment for prisoners of war. Tatsuya had scoffed at them before. Now the words held a desperate, tantalizing promise. Tatsuya found himself in a moral no-man's land. His culture, his entire existence demanded one path, to die honorably. But his heart demanded another, to live, to return, to build a future out of the ashes of the present. He was not a warrior by vocation, but a man who had been swept into a current he could not control. He found a small, smooth stone on the ground and rubbed it with his thumb. A small, almost imperceptible protest against the war. The stone was a reminder of something solid, something real in this world of smoke and shadow. His conversation with Kenji was a dance of doubt and despair. Kenji explained in a voice as dry as the volcanic ash on the ground that the captain was a man trapped, bound by honor to give an order he knew was meaningless. The war was already lost. The grand plan of a glorious empire had crumbled to dust. The final charge was not a valiant sacrifice, but a meaningless slaughter. Tatsuya felt a deep, profound sadness. He was not just fighting the enemy, but the weight of his own culture. He was a man suspended between two worlds, the past and the future, the lie and the truth. He decided he would not go. He would not die for a lost cause. He would live, even if it meant living in shame. The final assault began with a roar. The Americans, frustrated by the labyrinthine resistance, were now using flamethrowers and high-pressure pumps to force out the remaining soldiers. The tunnels filled with the smell of gasoline and the suffocating heat of fire. Tatsuya and Kenji were separated in the chaos, a wall of flame, a sudden, terrifying barrier between them. Tatsuya heard Kenji's distant screams, a single heartbreaking sound, and then nothing. He was alone. The sound of explosions and the roar of fire were a suffocating presence, a physical force that pushed him deeper into the earth. He ran, the fear a cold knot in his stomach. He was a rat in a maze, desperate for an escape. He turned down a passage, a narrow crack in the rock that seemed to lead nowhere. He heard the sound of footsteps, the roar of the fire, the distant screams. The labyrinth was a living thing, and it was closing in on him. He scurried, half crawling down the passage. The tunnel grew tighter, and he found himself in a small, empty chamber, a cold, dark crevice in the heart of the mountain. The noise faded. The screams died down. The war above, the final, desperate battle, ended. Silence, a true and permanent silence, fell over the island. Tatsuya remained. He was hungry, thirsty, and alone. He could go out, he could surrender, but the thought of being a prisoner, of living in a world that had betrayed him, was more terrifying than the thought of death. He was a man without a country, without a purpose. He had been a hero, a symbol of honor, and now he was a nameless shadow, a ghost in a cave. The days that followed were a blur of hunger and thirst, a slow, agonizing descent into a waking nightmare. He ate what he could, a meager diet of insects and wild plants, and drank the foul, sulfurous water that seeped from the rocks. His body became thin, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow. He was a survivor, but at what cost? He was no longer a man, but an animal, living by instinct, driven only by the primal need to breathe, to feel the cold, damp air in his lungs for one more moment. He did not die a martyr's death. He was not found, his story was not recorded. He simply faded into the rock, a silent victim of a war that had no room for humanity. He was the man of no return, the man who had promised his sister he would be home soon. He had sworn he would never surrender, and he hadn't. He lived, a solitary existence, without a home, without a purpose, without a witness. He was simply the ghost in the machine, the soldier in the cave, the man who was left behind. He was a memory lost to the world, a forgotten soul in a silent tomb. His life, his hopes, his quiet dreams of a peaceful future, all were buried with him in that dark, volcanic earth. The silence he had so feared in the beginning was now his only companion, a constant, final testament to the futility of his sacrifice.